So, if you remember last time, we were right in the middle of talking about Genesis. Well, kind of right at the end of talking about Genesis, because it turns out there's a lot to talk about with Genesis. So I promise we're not going to spend all of our time talking about, well, I wanted to give you a good introduction to the breadth that is sort of underneath the first text in the Bible. So we're going to kind of start to abbreviate that a little bit as we transition into the rest of the Pentateuch. But to finish off Genesis, remember in this section, kind of the mid to end section, we talked about the journey of Abraham and Sarai, the matriarchs and patriarchs. We talked a fair amount about the ideologies that make up Genesis. That is, those stories that are meant to explain why things are a certain way. Why is this named like this? Why are there pillars of salt here? Why do we do this one particular thing? Because a lot of the stories we find in the mid to end part of Genesis are stories that are meant to explain things like that for the community. One of the other things that we see in this particular part of Genesis is this idea of repetition. So you'll have stories about twin boys and childless women, and that's kind of a theme that happens throughout this part of Genesis. And we have yet another connection to a story of a neighboring culture, the Kurta. The Kurta is an Ugaritic story that's similar in structure to this particular part of Genesis. So there are several tablets that it was recorded on. Some of them, it seems like, have not survived, some of them that have. When we get to the first surviving tablet that we know about, we meet this character of Kurta, this male character, whose 7 wives have either died or have left him, and all of their children have died. So it almost starts out like a Job type story, right? Like something bad has happened to this particular person. And then in a dream, the god El gives Kurta instructions to go to another city where he's going to get a new spouse. And he goes to this new city, and on the way, he stops and builds a shrine for the goddess Asherah, makes a vow to present her with a lot of money if his journey is successful. And his journey is successful, and his marriage is blessed by the gods, and then he gets multiple children. So in some ways, it's very similar to the story of Abraham in terms of like being called away, but with a lot of other things too that are not similar to that story, obviously. But then, as that story continues, one of his new sons rebels, and Asherah curses him with illness for failing to live into his vow. And then some scholars would argue that then becomes a parallel to later stories we have of the revolt of Absalom against his father David. Right? So several of the themes that we see throughout the Hebrew Bible can be found in this one neighboring story from the culture of Ugarit. And then we don't know how, the ending has been lost, so we don't know how that story ends. So other similarities we have, this idea of ancestors who were childless. This is also similar to some of the things that we find in neighboring cultures. There's a divine promise of having children. There's this journey to seek another wife, which we also see, if you remember, Lot and Lot's daughters, making a vow after stopping at a shrine, and then ultimately this blessing through children. And it's likely that these two Canaanite communities, Ugarit and the Israelites, use these common motifs when telling the stories of their ancestral founders, right? So there were sort of certain genres or certain tropes that when we're talking about how our community formed and who the ancestors to our community are that get pulled in. And that's something that a lot of scholars argue. That's not good. Come on in, Karen. Okay, so let's talk about Joseph. Fun story, right? So it was probably originally a standalone narrative, like a novella or a work of historical fiction, as opposed to a composition of traditions that we've seen before. So this probably was one specific story that then gets included wholesale into Genesis. And it's different from the ancestor narratives that we've seen before. The plot now is concerned and set primarily in Egypt's court, right? It's not family-centered once we get past the whole selling your brother into slavery thing. So it's different from some of the other stories we've seen before. And it has a very distinctive Egyptian flavor, which is also new for us so far. And yet there's no kind of internal clues that help scholars to date it, right? If you remember the different types of biblical criticism, one of them is kind of looking for clues within the story itself. We don't have anything like that in here that would help us to do that. There's no one who matches the description of any of these characters within Egyptian records that would help us, outside of the story, kind of locate this within history. Now, it's possible, having said that, that this might be a reference to what is known in Egyptology as the Hyksos period. And I apologize to anyone who is a historian, because I probably, like I do with a lot of things, I probably butchered that word. And that was a period between the mid-17th and 16th centuries BCE, where Egypt was ruled by dynasties with people from a southwestern Asian origin. Semitic peoples were basically the pharaohs of Egypt, and there were a couple dynasties of these rulers. So that's, when we think about not only the Joseph story, but also the Moses narrative, which we'll get into a little bit, there's a distinct possibility that there's a recalling of that time when there were peoples who may have even been Canaanites, we don't know for sure, who were sort of running things in Egypt. But there are also links to other Egyptian and ancient literature from other cultures too in this cycle. You have, of course, remember Potiphar's wife, right? And that kind of seduction of Joseph that doesn't end up going well for him. That's very similar to a 13th century Egyptian story called The Tale of Two Brothers, where you have a very similar thing happening to one of the characters. And the idea of those 7 lean years that his dream kind of warns about and he's able to warn Pharaoh about, that is a convention that we find not only in Egyptian literature, but also Canaanite and Akkadian literature. So throughout that entire region of the world, there's this idea within the stories that there might be 7 lean years. That's something that was a sort of common trope, if you will, from that time. Now the image that you see here, this is really fascinating. This is an image of a procession of a people known as the Amu that was found in a tomb of an Egyptian great chief or regional leader named Khnumhotep II, who lived during the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom, so around 1900 BCE. And the reason why this is sort of interesting and important, because this is before the Hyksos period, but the scene is painted in this tomb that shows this group of Amu, who were Asiatic nomadic traders who were thought to be either Hyksos themselves or the peoples who came before them, who come from somewhere between the Transjordan and Mesopotamia itself. And notice how colorful the men's garments are as we think about the Joseph story, right? It's kind of interesting. And just to remind you, this is the Transjordan right here. So it's possible that these people came from all the way over in Mesopotamia, but it's also possible that they were pretty close to the Red Sea right in that area. We obviously don't know for sure. Any questions on that? Give you this one again, if you want to take a look at that. So when we talk about sort of historicity, both within the Joseph narrative and in Exodus that we'll get into in a second, there are parallels where these cultures came together. There's a reason why the Bible spends a lot of time thinking about Egypt, because we know from the archaeological record that there was a lot of contact between these two people groups, both in terms of who was kind of in charge of who and how trade worked and all that other stuff, which makes sense, right? They're neighbors. One of them typically was more powerful than the other. Now, let's move on to the next book, shall we? Exodus. Exodus begins with the Moses narrative. Some of you might remember we started one of the first couple weeks in September. We heard that in worship. Within the Moses narrative, you have the birth narrative, right? That he's left in this ark. The word is actually similar to the word that's used for casket, which is kind of interesting and put sort of a darker spin on how Moses is sort of put into the river. And it happens during this time of genocide. Again, remember the Pharaoh in the story doesn't like the Israelites anymore and is trying everything he can to sort of get rid of them, including genocide. And then we have this miracle where sort of he's found by the princess and he ends up getting raised by his mom anyway, who offers to serve as essentially a wet nurse for him. So he ends up growing up in the court of Pharaoh. He then sees this overseer sort of beating a person from his own tribal group and ends up killing him, runs away into exile as a fugitive from justice. He has this theophany with the burning bush, right? Remember that one? Returns to Egypt to confront Pharaoh, calls to lead his people into the promised land. Then you have the plagues and the Passover, the parting of the sea, and the wandering into the wilderness, right? It's a fascinating story, and there's a lot there. As an aside, how many of you have heard the phrase Sea of Reeds? or Red Sea when we're talking about the parting of the sea. So the text there, depending on kind of which translation you're looking at, it's often translated, at least into English, as Red Sea. It's probably closer to Sea of Reeds. We don't know for certain where that is, but scholars have identified several places around there. So it's possible that it could have been, and it could be anywhere really between the Gulf of Suez and the Mediterranean. We don't know for sure. It most likely originally was not the Red Sea itself. So, scholars, especially scholars that are looking for this event, historical event, it makes more sense that it might have been like in a coastal area than it would have been in the Red Sea, but we don't know for sure in the text itself. There are actually 3 versions of that event that are placed together when you look at kind of sort of what is behind the text, and they're not necessarily entirely compatible, so there's some confusion that happens within there. Now, let's continue the discussion we just had on Exodus and history, right? Christians and of course Jews before us, and still, I would think, ask questions about whether or not this is historical. Did the Exodus narrative happen? Right? If so, what evidence is there? And the thing is, there's no evidence outside the story itself saying that anything like this happened in the way that it's written. We've never found archaeological evidence of a massive army that got swept under the waters. There's nothing in any of the Egyptian writings we found, and we've found a lot of Egyptian writings that would talk about this massive calamity having happened to a particular pharaoh. There's just nothing there. Another question that often comes up is traditionally who wrote Exodus? Do you all remember? You may have heard. Right. There's this tradition that says, well, Moses wrote this. And again, the authorship points to this having been written at different times, and so probably not. Also, Moses probably wouldn't have written about his own death if he had been the whole Pentateuch. I mean, I don't know, maybe, and then I had a beautiful death surrounded by all my wife and children, and everything is great forever again. But probably not, right? So we don't know who originally authored these, at least in any way that sort of we have evidence for. Also, again, no evidence of destruction of the Egyptian army. There's no evidence that there was a massive death of firstborns that would have been happening anytime around the 13th century, which is when this is probably set as. But if we ask, could anything in this story be historical? The answer is probably. We know that Egypt knew a group of people, not a state or a place, that were known as Israel, at least as far back as the 13th century BCE. And if you remember back to the picture I just showed, that goes back to about 1900 BCE, right? So not only were they in relationship with, had, sort of vassal relationships, trading relationships with people from this area going back hundreds of years before this, but they knew of a specific people called Israel as far back as the 13th century. I think I showed you a stele before I got sick, so it feels like a year ago when we were first starting to meet about that. But if I didn't, or if you don't remember, there's a stele that talks about, one of those standing stones that talks about sort of all the great things one of the pharaohs did. And one of the things it talks about is this group of people, Israel. And the way that it's written down, it's not a place or even sort of like a nation, it's like an ethnic group. So at least as early as the 13th century, we have a specific ethnic group that Egypt knows as Israel. Again, there are also records of Semitic peoples, probably from Canaan, being subjugated to Egypt and in Egypt, and that we know that Egypt controlled those lands during multiple different periods, if you remember back to those maps from those first couple of areas. And of course, as I mentioned last time, there was the Hyksos periods. There were 2 dynasties of pharaohs who were pharaohs of Semitic origin. And of course, there's no specific evidence that those pharaohs were Israelites. It does make sense that a Semitic pharaoh would be more open to settlement from other Semitic peoples, right? Like we see in the Joseph narrative. And this part is really fascinating. Moses is actually a very common part of Egyptian names. And this is really interesting. So think like Thutmose or Ramses or the regional chief I named. That kind of, that Mose or that Mes, it's different conjugations of things, it comes from a root that means child of. But not like child of a person, specifically child of a god. So like Thutmose is child of Thoth, and Ramses is child of Ra. So Moses is a partial name that you would have within Egyptian with this root. And it makes sense that if Moses had a fuller name, right, son of a certain Egyptian god, and he becomes this hero to this group of Israelites, it would be embarrassing for them to have a hero whose name is of a pagan god from their perspective, right? So it makes sense that you would sort of, if there was a person in history, or even like an ancestor like Abraham, it makes sense that they would sort of cut that off and sort of forget about the part that goes back to Ra or whatever god that this person's name was, and then they remember the Moses part. So that's kind of interesting. It also is possible that Exodus remembers a tradition of an Egyptian-born Israelite leading a smaller group of formerly enslaved peoples out of Egypt and back to Canaan, where they would have settled in the hill country and eventually joined with other Canaanites in the area and eventually formed an Israelite identity. We don't have evidence directly for that, but it's very possible. And then we have this right here, this little scarab. So that is a drawing that was made of an Egyptian scarab that was found at the site of the Hyksos capital. And it depicts the pharaoh as a weather god. And some scholars argue that's a depiction of Baal. Remember Baal? Right? That's pretty... There were some interesting things happening in Egypt during that time that relate very closely to the Moses narrative. Any questions or comments so far? How are you all doing? Okay, cool. Now, things are going to continue to get more interesting. If we go back to Moses' birth, we have what we would call a rescue narrative, right? Baby Moses gets rescued and then starts his new life together. You might be unsurprised to learn that's also something that we find in other literature from that region in this early period. The idea of a hero being saved from death as an infant, that's not a new idea now, and it wasn't a new idea as the Pentateuch is being put together. And there's a pretty direct parallel to the rescue of the baby Moses that's found in a first millennia legend that looks back to the third millennia, the great Akkadian king Sargon the Great. And so let's read this together. I am Sargon, the great king, the king of Akkad. My mother was a priestess. My father I did not know. My priestess mother conceived me. In secret she gave birth to me. She set me in a basket of reeds. She caulked its opening with bitumen. She cast me into the river from which I could not rise. The river carried me off. It brought me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, brought me up as he dipped his bucket. Aki, the drawer of water, raised me as his son. So what do you notice in that story that we just read?
There's the parallel with basket in the river.
Right.
From the Moses story.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's opposite of the Moses story because the priestess gave birth, but the peasant raised.
Yeah, that's interesting. Something else I noticed is I don't recall there being much talk about Moses' dad in that story either. So it's interesting how these stories will often parallel one another. I don't want to read any more into it than that, but I just thought that was rather fascinating. Any other things you all noticed before we get into some other fun things in the early part of Moses?
Well, weren't priestess usually virgins?
That's a good question. I think it depends on whatever cultic group they were a part of. You know, we often we think of like in Rome, certainly like Vestia, the Vestal virgins. That was certainly true there. I don't know about ancient Southwest Asian cultic practices and how that would work. That's a really good question, though.
Well, I mean, that might be the reason she tossed them in the river.
It could be, because it does say that she gave birth in secret. And in some religious traditions, if you're a religious leader, and this is still true today, you're not really supposed to be having kids, depending on the tradition. So that's interesting. All right. So there's another early story for you all. All right. let's talk about the divine name, because this is also something that gets revealed for the first time in this story. The Hebrew there is Aa Asher Aa, which translates to I will be who I will be. And this is the name that God has for God's self revealed to Moses when they're in that burning bush. And as an aside, I don't know if you know this, but the burning bush is the symbol for the Church of Scotland and has historically been. So our kind of mother Kirk uses that as its symbol. I mean, we have a pretty cool and interesting symbol, and it has enough symbolism that I don't actually probably remember what all of it means. I don't know if you've ever been through the Presbyterian cross, but every single part means a different thing. But I've always appreciated the burning bush symbolism. Anyway, so the name that we know of God, that's sort of the academic construction of which is Yahweh, is Vod He Yahweh, these 4 Hebrew consonants. And that comes out of this Aa Asher Aa. It's the name of this deity that comes from the verb to be, which is sort of fascinating, right? So God is, God will be. It's kind of an interesting way to name something. And the earliest known extra-biblical reference that we have to this God's name, Yahweh, we have right here in the stele. It's a Moabite stele called the Mesha stele. And as you can see here, the creator of this photograph helpfully pointed out where God's name is, and then that's what God's name looks like in Proto-Hebrew. I'm trying to remember, that looks similar to what I kind of remember. Did any of you see I've asked this before, but did any of you see the Dead Sea Scrolls when they were traveling around the United States like 10-ish years ago? Yeah, this looks similar to what I remember seeing some of the divine names, because in those scrolls, they wrote them in an earlier script, just to kind of re-emphasize how important and holy God's name is. So that's what it looks like there. So it's written in Proto-Hebrew. In the name of this whole stele is written in the name of King Mesha of Moab, and it tells the story of how their god Shemosh had been angry at the people and allowed them to be subjugated by the kingdom of Israel as a punishment, and then eventually relents, rescues them, allows them to come back, right? So think Isaiah, right? There's also a parallel there, which is kind of interesting. And then within this, at some point, there's this passage that says, I took the vessels of Yahweh and I hauled them before the face of Shemosh. So that's the first thing we've ever actually found outside of scripture that, and the earliest. So this dates back to, I did not write that down, I want to say around 900 BCE when this was found. It also parallels the story that we find in 2 Kings 3, which is kind of interesting. So it's sort of a parallel to that story, written from a different perspective. Okay. Now, as Exodus continues, we've been through the waters. We're now on our journey to Sinai as the narrative continues. And we have these really interesting stories that come out, right? People are hungry, they're tired, they're thirsty. And like a lot of people, they complain when they're tired and hungry and thirsty and they've been walking for a long time. And so then we have these sort of divine interventions in that. Manna, for instance. Does anyone know what the word manna means? It means, what is it? Sort of a fun way for, whatever food, what is it? And the point to this, I think, is it's the point doesn't matter what it is. And there's been a lot of speculation as to what it could be. Is this a type of like bacterial growth that you could eat? Is this some sort of like bread flakes that sort of falls from the sky? Like what, we don't know what that is. Some scholars have argued that I remember reading an article maybe 3 or 4 years ago. There's actually like a natural phenomenon that happens in that area that it could be. So it's possible that this is tied to a very natural event. But in the story, that's not the point, right? And to me, this is one of those places where if we keep trying to find, like, is this real or not? Could this be? We sort of miss the overall point. Because the point is that God provides exactly what we need, right? If we try to get too much of it, that's bad, right? It goes bad if you collect too much. But if you're not able to collect enough, somehow miraculously you have enough, right? It's a story about, it's a metaphor for how God's economy works and how God sort of expects human beings to live with one another and amongst creation. That's kind of the point to the story. So for me, that's more important than what it is. But if you want to go down those rabbit holes, they're fascinating. Just Again, as some of us were talking about earlier, beware of YouTube rabbit holes, because I don't want any of you to accidentally end up becoming flat earth people. Not that there's anything wrong, but there's some interesting things on the internet. So you just got to be careful with some of those sources. I'll just put it that way. Water, same thing, right? Moses strikes his staff, water comes out. It's God providing for the people. It's the idea that they're not reliant on themselves, they're not reliant on on sort of the empire that they were part of before. Because remember, when people are tired and hungry, it was better to be enslaved but not be hungry and dying in the wilderness than it is, in some people's perspective, to be free but dying in the wilderness. And so there's this theme throughout there that God is providing, God is taking care of them. You don't need to go back to empire. God's taking care of you. And 3 months later, they make it to Mount Sinai. And I really failed by not putting this meme in there. I don't know if you've seen the cartoon of the people following Moses, and like they're snaking around, they keep saying recalculating, and Moses is starting to get a little fed up with that. But it kind of feels like that, right? Because we don't know exactly for sure where the Mount Sinai or Horeb is, because in the Bible, it's both Horeb and Sinai, and those might be different places. We're not really sure. But it probably wouldn't take 3 months to just, kind of straight line go there. So they're meandering a bit. So 3 months later, they make it to Mount Sinai. And of course, that's where we start to have these stories about the covenant and the Ten Commandments. Any questions or comments so far? As I give my voice a rest. Thank you all for keeping up with this. I know this is kind of an info dump, but there's a lot here. Okay, so covenants are something that are very important, particularly in the Pentateuch, but throughout the Hebrew Bible, right? The idea that God is in relationship with these people. But one of the things that's very interesting about them is these covenants, they're legal agreements, and it turns out they're based off legal agreements that were known at the time, right? If you were to meet, should they exist, say 10th century BCE lawyer, they would probably recognize this format, because what we see, especially in Exodus with the covenants that we see written out between God and the people, are based on vassal treaties that were very common in ancient Southwest Asia at the time. So for instance, we found a Hittite treaty, and in that treaty there's the identity of what's known as the suzerain, i.e. the one who's in control, like the person that you're paying homage to. There's a history of their relationship. There are stipulations, right? Who has certain obligations to who. It actually writes out like who gets a copy. When we think about like the 10 Commandments going into the Ark of the Covenant, that's their copy. The reason why there's two made is not because it's 5 on one, 5 on the other, and then 10 through or 11 through 15 on the one that Mel Brooks drops. Right? It's that they're two copies of the same thing. One of them is the people's copy, and they actually also get to keep God's copy, because God's God, and God probably doesn't need a tablet, right? God. Anyway, that's a whole other theological issue right there. And then as it keeps going, there's divine witnesses to the treaty, right? There's this idea that, particularly in the Hittite versions, that the other gods or the other divine beings, remember we talked about in cosmology, what the Hebrew Bible sort of lands on as being divine messengers or other kind of divine beings. In some cultures are also just other gods that may be sort of lesser gods in the pantheon. But there's this idea that there are witnesses from on high that are kind of watching this treaty get signed. And then there are blessings for carrying it out and curses for violations. And that way of doing a treaty is very similar to the ways in which the people of Israel enter into this relationship with God, which is sort of fascinating or very boring. It depends on if you're into, legal documents and ancient history. And then, of course, we get to the big one, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. Moses meets with God upon the mountain. There's this theophany, like his face, when he's later seen by the people, is literally radiating. And there's these manifestations of divine presence that people would have known that time that occur. So it's written that the people who are watching this, they experience thunder and lightning and fire and smoke and an earthquake and a trumpet blast. And then God's voice is heard by the Israelites. And then we get these 10 words or commandments that come out of them. Now, what's interesting is there are actually 3 different versions of these 10 commandments that happen in different places, including Deuteronomy. And you heard me preach on, I think it was the Deuteronomy one very recently, Or no, maybe it was it. You'd think I'd remember when I preached on a month ago, but sorry. I think Audrey's surgery sort of wiped that part of my memory. It went well, though. It's fine. But then the narrative shifts after we get this 10 Commandments. And the rest is just kind of instructions that God gives to Moses about how to do all that treaty stuff, right? Kind of the legalese when you're sitting with your lawyer. And, okay, so you just signed this agreement, you have to do this, except it's God telling you what to do with that. Okay. Clear as mud? All right. So, the covenant code. We have a lot of law that we find throughout the Pentateuch, including in Exodus. Some of that is known as the covenant code. And that's basically case law, what we would call case law. How many of you have heard of the Code of Hammurabi? Okay. So there's another stela that has these, it's basically an ancient law. And one of the reasons why it's so important is it's written in multiple languages. And so we're able to learn, and I'm forgetting off the top of my head. Do you know what languages were on that one?
I don't remember.
Yeah, it was like Middle Egyptian, Hebrew, and I think another language. It might have been cuneiform. Anyway, we were able to learn a lot about comparative language work and figure out certain languages from there. And it's actually one of the reasons, as an aside, why I know a lot of folks sort of look at the King James as being the end-all be-all of biblical translations in English, and it's a beautiful translation. But some of the things we've learned since then, which have also come from the Hammurabi Code, is some of the words that were not able to be translated, and they sort of did their best guess. We now know kind of what the cognates were in other languages. So it's, anyway. And that is one of those finds that has helped us significantly with that. And within this case law, within the covenant code, we find everything from how to worship God to personal injury law. There apparently were personal injury lawyers even back then. Probably didn't have billboards, maybe just something chiseled on a tree somewhere, call 888, whatever, if you fall and slip. They even have building codes. One of my favorite verses of scripture is a building code about how you have to have parapets on the roof of your house so that if someone comes over and sleeps, they don't fall off in the middle of the night. That's in Deuteronomy, so I probably shouldn't be talking about that yet. But one of the things they also talk about within these covenant codes is worship. How should the cultic rituals work? How should worship work? Now, when I talk about cult amongst academic scholars in the ancient world meant something very different than cult does now, right? When we think about cult, we think about, things that we can find on Netflix or whatever, right? And it often doesn't end well, right? But the word itself just refers to religious practice, basically. Because again, as I think we talked about a while ago, within a lot of these ancient cultures, their culture was so kind of enmeshed that language and religion and kind of law all sort of became one thing. So the things that we would think about as the secular and the religious were all kind of one. And so cultic practices were those intentional things that you did to worship God, right? Like, what were the role of priests and priestesses in their society? How did you offer sacrifice? All those things would be called cultic ritual. And within Exodus, there's a lot written about how it is that you properly worship God. Even down to what the priests are supposed to wear, their vestments. One of the reasons why Christian pastors often wear the things they wear, that's tied directly into, at least theologically, some of the things that the Bible talks about people wearing as well. Although they got to include a very cool ephod, which had this beautiful ornamentation that was probably used for divination, that was like gold and had, they did look a lot cooler. I mean, maybe some of our Episcopalian and Orthodox friends tend to look that cool too. We're a little bit more pared down and modernist, but that's fine. That's a whole nother class, talking about the aesthetics of clergy and worship, and is that a good thing or not? Anyway, so all that is kind of spelled out here. And that's probably a reason why we don't often preach about these texts, because, it's interesting from a historical perspective, but not maybe the most hope-giving and affirming for a community. And it gets a little boring. And that's fine. And then we get to the ark, right? You all know the ark, right? Or at least have seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. Yeah. Oh, there you go. Careful, this is going on YouTube, ironically, so you may not want to say that out loud. So, what the ark was creating a dwelling place for God on earth. The mercy seat, which is kind of, if you've seen images of, or again, remember Raiders of the Lost Ark, you have the cherubs going like this with their big wings. That space between the wings was called the mercy seat, and that was considered to be God's throne. And it makes sense, right? Usually you would worship God in a temple or a shrine or like a grove of trees, but if you're people on the move, having a way to transport your God with you makes sense, right? So your God is always with you. And that is how they kind of solve the problem of typically a God would be regional God, because, here's your town, here's some villages, here's your worship site. But if you're a people in the wilderness for at least a generation, where does your God live? Well, you build a place for God to live and you take God along with you. And within that ark, it's said that there was, well, depending on what source you're reading, probably a bit of manna that somehow made it, and then the copies of the Ten Commandments, the covenant between God and Israel, gets placed in there. It, for the people, becomes a visible sign of God's invisible presence. It's a reminder that God is there with them. And in the stories, when they get into conflicts with other groups of people, the ark is carried with them, and it's presumed that if the ark is with them, they will be victorious. Right? That then gets into the tabernacle, and here is a contemporary reconstruction that exists in a park in Israel right now. So that's what it looked like. The tabernacle was the tent of meeting, right? So as they go around, they kind of stop in a place for a while, at least long enough to get that set up. And that, that looks sort of complex enough that it kind of starts to make more sense why maybe it took a generation to get there, because if you're hauling this around, you're probably not going to set that up for an overnight kind of thing, right? You're going to move around and stay for a while. And within this tent of meeting, and it's presumed that the layout actually represents what the first temple would have been laid out. So you have this outer courtyard, and you have places where the offerings would have been taken, and I forget what that is precisely, but these are places where offerings were given, where worship was happening. And then within here, you have the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies, which is where the ark lived. And that layout of having two distinct spaces separated by a curtain is exactly how the temple is laid out. And having this outer courtyard is also, again, how they lay out their first temple. Now, who remembers the golden calf? Right? So it turns out if you're up on a mountain talking to God for a very long time, and the people are just kind of hanging out, and it says that this takes 40 days, and the people want to worship, right? It makes sense that, okay, well, they're up there doing their thing. Let's find a way to worship God. And so you get to this golden calf. And so for a long time, people have wondered, well, what does that mean? Like, are they going back to worshiping other gods? And the thing of it is, as Aaron makes this golden statue of a young bull, this probably was not meant to be some other god that they were going to worship. They're probably not committing idolatry. And the reason is that both the Canaanite god El and Yahweh were known as the bull, and were often represented by the animal, the bull. Remember this from that jar that we found where you have Yahweh and his Asherah? Look at the faces on this close-up. What animal does that remind you of? If you can see from there. Right? It's meant to be a bull.
Cow, bull.
Yeah, cow and a bull. And then this is a bronze calf, but that was found at a worship site in Samaria, right? Where the kingdom of Israel was, and it dates to the 12th century BCE. That imagery, and those get used on, underneath one of the places of sacrifice within the temple itself. But this is a common image for worshiping even of God. So most likely what was happening is they were not worshiping some other god. They were trying to worship Yahweh. But remember the commandment against graven images, not making an image of me? So that's most likely kind of theologically where the problem was and why the people end up getting, in trouble for that. But what was probably also happening underneath the text is, if you remember, and that, I don't think that sheet, remember back to when we did that sheet, we talked about there was a group of people called the Deuteronomistic historians, right, who wrote Deuteronomy and a lot of other things. It was a group of priests who did a lot of the writing. Well, they were very kind of Judah focused, very southern kingdom focused. They didn't like the things that the northern kingdom was doing. So they sided more with Moses than Aaron. And so it's very likely that this is kind of a snub against the northern kingdom in sort of an oblique way. Because again, this comes from the northern kingdom, right? So the idea of worshiping God as a bull very likely was something that would have been normalized within that part of the people of God with the northern tribes. And so this becomes another way of sort of saying what they're doing is wrong, we do things the right way, don't worship this image, and you can only worship in one space. The other thing that's happening there too is it's the idea that you can only worship God in the correct space, right? So they're trying to worship God where they are and not up on the mountain where God is. So those things together are probably why the story is written in the way that it is written. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, we then have the next version of the Ten Commandments that we find also in Exodus. So there's actually two versions of the Ten Commandments in Exodus. And this is what is known as the ritual Decalogue. So after Moses gets mad and after God gets mad and all these things happen, he goes back up the mountain for another 40 days and nights and gets another set of 10 commandments that were then broken. And in this tradition, there's more of a sense of how the worship of God should not be interrupted by the local traditions, by Canaanite traditions. You remember me talking about last week in the sermon how there were questions at different times about intermarriage and could you marry into people from other cultures. Intermarriage in this set of commandments is forbidden. And also there's this big push on keeping holy days and keeping festivals and kind of describing what the festivals look like. So there's a reason why we don't really spend a ton of time with this version of the Ten Commandments, because it's very specific to this culture and this time in ways that kind of do not kill, do not steal are. And then as we finish up, in the narrative, the Ark and the Tabernacle are both constructed based off of all the instructions they've gotten for doing that. And then you have the tent of meeting is finally there, and again, looks like this. And then this cloud kind of covers the tent of meeting, as theologically it's understood that the presence of God transfers from with the people in a cloud of smoke into or around the ark. And then that's where God's presence is presumed to be forever. So that's Exodus, and we've got 2 minutes before choir, so I'm going to end us there. Any questions or comments? I'm going to try to get us through the rest of the Pentateuch next week. We will see. Because again, I'm trying to get through this class